Hi everyone. We're back with lectures 17 and 18 on World War II. We mentioned in our previous lecture how the United States declared neutrality as soon as World War II was declared. And what we'll see is that by 1941, things were looking grim for the Allied powers. France had been taken over by Germany. Hitler controlled much of the continent. And for a time, Great Britain was the single Allied power standing between Nazi Germany and total domination of the continent. With their Western Front secured, however, Germany will make the decision to violate an agreement that they had made several years prior with the Soviet Union not to invade them. Confident that it was just a matter of time before Great Britain also fell in the West, in the summer of 1941, German operatives began Operation Barbarossa. In this way, by attacking the Soviet Union, Adolf Hitler hoped to secure the Eastern Front of the Nazi Empire. What it will do, though, is, of course, bring the Soviet Union into the Second World War. Josef Stalin was the dictator of the Soviet Union during this period, and he was already a man who was known for his cruelty towards many of those that lived under his rule, and you can imagine his shock and anger when he realized that Adolf Hitler had not, in fact, kept his promise not to attack the Soviet Union. What this means is now by the summer of 1941, Great Britain was joined by the Soviet Union in fighting in Europe. And of course, China had been fighting all along as an allied power in the Pacific, trying to fight off Japanese aggression. It should be noted, though, early on in our discussion, that Stalin did not like the United States. It represented capitalism and everything that he disliked. But when the United States joins the war, and we're getting to that here in just a few minutes, Stalin will be open to the idea of coordinating with the United States to help bring down Nazi Germany. However, for the United States, without an overt act of hostility on the part of Germany against U.S. interest, President Franklin D. Roosevelt could not arguably convince Americans that they should join the Second World War. He sympathized deeply with Great Britain and was trying through back channels to offer aid to Great Britain to keep up the fight against Nazi aggression, but most Americans were simply not interested in joining the war. That is, until U.S. interests were directly affected. December 7th, 1941, we'll see an act of overt Japanese aggression in the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the naval station in Hawaii. It will be Japan, not Germany, that will provoke the United States to join in the Second World War. This unprovoked attack resulted in the deaths of more than 2,400 Americans and the destruction or damage to 14 ships and almost 200 airplanes. President Roosevelt immediately went on the radio to address a shocked American public, noting that December 7th was a date that will live in infamy. He then went on to ask Congress for a declaration of war, which was promptly granted. But again, things looked terrible for the Allied cause when the United States ultimately joined the war effort. Germany dominated much of Europe from Norway to Greece and had rapidly pushed into the Soviet Union and southward into North Africa with their so-called Blitzkrieg strategy. Blitzkrieg means lightning warfare. The concept is be ready to pounce on your enemy very quickly and with overwhelming force so that they don't even know that you're coming, almost like a strike of lightning. In other words, that's why it's known as Blitzkrieg or lightning war. In the Atlantic Ocean, German submarines were routinely sinking hundreds of Allied ships, endangering supply lines for desperate troops in the field. Japan also appeared seemingly unstoppable in the Pacific Ocean. By this point, they had taken over much of Southeast Asia, in addition to northern China, and were soon to overrun Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. The Chinese had been fighting unassisted for years at this point, trying to stave off more loss of territory and their citizenry by this Japanese onslaught. Much to the surprise of Adolf Hitler, though, The United States began to mobilize for World War II very quickly, so quickly that, Adolf Hitler, this was throwing off his timeline. He was hoping to have time to knock out the Soviet Union and then face American troops. How did America prepare so quickly? Roosevelt oversaw the creation of several new federal agencies to speed up American manufacturing of guns and wartime supplies. For instance, he created the War Production Board, which was in charge of building new factories and awarding government war supply contracts to private industries. With the U.S. government now closely monitoring the production of everything from ships to uniforms to packaged meals for the troops, during World War II, the United States produced a staggering amount of war materiel, some 6,500 cargo ships and naval vessels, 86,000 tanks, almost 300,000 airplanes, and some 15 million rifles and machine guns. Another important step that FDR's government sponsored was the creation of the Manhattan Project in 1942. This highly secretive project began with several German Jewish scientists who were being persecuted in Nazi Germany, fleeing to the United States and notifying President Franklin D. Roosevelt, hey, the Germans are working on what we would call today a weapon of mass destruction. The Germans are already underway testing and trying to develop an atomic weapon, which would be, a significant strength to the Nazi arsenal. You've probably heard the name of one of these scientists, although not in this context. Perhaps you've heard of Albert Einstein. He was one that signed a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt urging him to please begin a program in the United States to try and race the Germans to creating an atomic weapon first. Before we get into military strategy, though, and how the war was fought overseas, we need to take a few minutes to look at life on the home front in the United States during World War II, looking at the effects that the war had on American society as a whole. Wartime recruitment efforts began almost immediately after Pearl Harbor. A national draft was instituted, and during the war, more than 15 million American men and women served in uniform. And as the first of their numbers began to leave on deployments overseas in 1942, hordes of young men and women began getting married after relatively quick courtships. Fear of an uncertain future, a fear of dying overseas, led many to marry prematurely. As a result, the divorce rate actually spiked over time in the United States, as some of these quickie marriages didn't prove to be suited to the long haul. All these hasty marriages also affected the birth rate in the United States. Many so-called goodbye babies were conceived before the husband left for his tour of duty. Folks were clearly thinking about death and continuing family lines, so it's interesting to see some of these demographic shifts in the country. The wartime economy also brought about full employment in the United States for the first time in over a decade. You can see the chart here on the slide, how, especially starting in 1942, once the United States joins the war, everyone can now find a job. The preparation for World War II, the mobilization of industry in the United States, is what finally brings the country out of the Great Depression. There were actually labor shortages in some industries during the war. Here is where we begin to see women entering the industrial workforce in large numbers, even larger numbers than they did during the Great War. Here's the famous wartime poster of Rosie the Riveter, "We can do it." By 1945, women made up 36% of the workforce, pitching in and filling traditionally male-dominated jobs such as riveters, lumberjacks, welders, crane operators, and police officers. Women also served overseas during the conflict, helping soldiers in battle in numerous ways. In all, over 150,000 American women served in the Women's Army Corps during World War II. African American men and women aided the war effort both at home and abroad during the conflict. In the 1940s, for example, almost 1.2 million Black Americans migrated from the South to industrial cities in the North to help fill these gaps in the industrial workforce. And many Black leaders also saw similarities between the discrimination that Jews were facing in Nazi Germany at the hands of Adolf Hitler, and the ongoing persistent racial discrimination here in the United States. Thus emerged the Double V campaign among the African American community during the war. This campaign urged the United States on towards victory over Nazi Germany. That was one V. And the second V was for victory at home over racism and inequality. African Americans also served honorably in the military. Despite continued segregation of the armed forces, nearly 1 million black men and women wore the U.S. uniform. The War Department also began a program in July of 1941 to train black pilots and grounds crewmen during the war. The graduates of these programs that were held at the Tuskegee Institute became known as the Tuskegee Airmen. They were trained not only as pilots, but as ground crew members and mechanics, flight engineers, gunners, and armorers. Graduates of this program went on to fly planes during the war, providing crucial air support to ground troops. In fact, the all-black 99th Pursuit Squadron won a total of 80 distinguished flying crosses for their bravery during the conflict. Americans of all backgrounds also supported the war effort here at home. Very quickly, we start to see a shortage of some basic goods in the United States. Now that manufacturing centers that normally produce consumer foods were converted to produce defense goods, we're starting to see that Americans are having to make do with a lack of some basic items. To help out, Americans were encouraged to plant so-called victory gardens, to grow their own food as a show of patriotism, and to make sure that our soldiers overseas were being fed first. Many important food items, for example, were even rationed by the federal government, such as meat and butter. Non-consumable goods, such as rubber tires, were rationed as well. Fuel oil was also rationed during the conflict. And to help lower gas consumption across the country, the government imposed a 35-mile-an-hour nationwide speed limit. And as car makers converted production to making Jeeps and other wartime vehicles, there were no new passenger cars made available to the public for the duration of the war. It didn't matter how much money you had, there were no cars being produced and sold to the public. Everything now had shifted to military production only. Another effect of the war on the home front was the atmosphere of fear created by government propaganda, encouraging Americans to watch constantly for spies in their midst. While some of these posters seem a little bit humorous to us, others are blatantly racist. We see a rising tide of anti-Japanese hysteria stoked in part by our government during World War II. Even more ominously, we will see the internment of people of Japanese ancestry here in the United States. We will see American citizens that just happen to have a Japanese ancestry deprived of their civil rights and forcibly relocated to a series of internment camps throughout the Southwest. Many of these families were second, third, fourth generation American families who owned homes and businesses who were now being told you must abandon everything and come to one of these camps where you will be guarded by armed guards 24 hours a day. Why did the Roosevelt administration violate the rights of these American citizens? Racism. There was a fear that if you were of Japanese ancestry, that you were secretly aiding and abetting the enemy. This was a disaster for these citizens' lives. When the war was finally over and they were allowed to return to their homes and businesses, they had simply been taken over by squatters, and many of them lost their livelihoods as a result of this episode. In a bitter irony, the 442nd Infantry Regiment out of Hawaii was comprised largely of second-generation Japanese Americans. This particular regiment ends up being the most decorated unit in the history of U.S. warfare for their bravery in World War II, fighting on behalf of a country that was, at the same time they were fighting, imprisoning some of their own relatives back home. We'll turn to fighting the war in the second part of this lecture.